Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rigo Villa. I'm one of the community managers on the Cisco Learning Network, and I'll be your host today. In this session, we will be covering scaling deployments for long-term success with our speaker and presenter, Patrick Lloyd. But before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, I want to let our attendees know that if we run into any technical issues during the webinar, we'll do our very best to resolve it as soon as possible. So we just want to thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Next, if you have any questions during the session, we ask that you please post them in the question and answer panel, as that would help our panelists manage to keep track of all of their questions and would also allow them to provide you with a much more timely response. Also, if you experience any audio streaming issues during the live presentation, I do recommend using the call-in telephone number that I'm going to be posting in the chat window here in just a moment. And at the end of this webinar, you're going to get a pop-up survey with a couple of questions about today's presentation. And we would really appreciate it if you can just take a moment to fill it out and share with us any thoughts or feedback that you may have about today's session. I also want to let our attendees know that this session will be recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing within approximately 5 business days after today. And I'll be sure to share some more information about that in the chat window a little bit later on. And last but not least, I want to let everyone know about our next few webinars coming up. For the session coming up in October, October 1st to be exact, we're going to be diving into IBNS 2.0 switch templates for ISE deployments. And then getting us closer towards the end of the year, we are going to be covering ISE integration with Splunk. That's going to be on November 5th. And I'm going to be sharing some information on how you can register for these upcoming sessions a little bit later on as well. And without any further delay, I am now going to turn it over to our speaker to get us started. So Patrick, if you're ready, please take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rigo. Um, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Patrick Lloyd. Today's presentation is going to be on scaling deployments for long-term success. This is an approach that we as advanced services have used for quite a bit of time now in terms of scaling deployments, whether greenfield and assisting our customers with pre-purchase or pre-sales approach to ICE, or evaluating ICE as it's already deployed and answering that burning question in everybody's mind. What does my deployment actually look like, and how many more sessions can I add to it? As I said, my name is Patrick Lloyd. I'm a senior solutions architect. Worked for Cisco Security Services, so the professional services arm of Cisco. I'm a co-author on the Zero Trust Architectures book that came out in August of 22. I've been with Cisco for just over 14 years now, 10 of those in security services. Previous to that, as a route switch architect. My previous lives as a DoD contractor doing online education systems and programming, running a higher education help desk in the technology field. And as kind of a fun fact, I'm a private pilot and based out of Ocala, Florida. So let's dive right into it. Let's talk a little bit about what scaling of ICE looks like and why it's so important. To start off with, ICE is kind of the cornerstone of zero trust. And within the Zero Trust Architectures book, we talk about 5 different capabilities that any organization needs to begin their zero trust journey. Those 5 pillars are policy and governance, and this is going to be anything from onboarding policy, data governance policy, business resilience, or the policy that dictates what types of endpoints that users are able to bring onto the network and how they're able to use them. The second pillar is going to be identity, and this is going to be what we refer to as contextual identity. It's going to be a user, it's going to be a device, it's going to be a location, it's going to be a medium. And that who, what, where, and how is essentially the cornerstone of ensuring that you know who is on that network, so that you're not just saying this IP address is talking to this IP address. And oh, by the way, it's DHCP, which means absolutely nothing about 8 hours from now. The third capability is vulnerability management. And vulnerability management is not only your intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, your endpoint protection, et cetera, but also traffic baselining. And traffic baselining is essentially going to be the major missing aspect that most of our customers have when it comes to a need to implement some sort of segmentation strategy or a group-based policy strategy. The fourth mechanism is going to be your enforcement. And enforcement is going to be based on what we refer to as trust boundaries. Those trust boundaries essentially can outline how devices interact within a VLAN, within a switch, within a site, within a campus, or across campuses and worldwide. Those enforcement mechanisms differ based on where that trust boundary sits and essentially what you need to protect the network from. And then finally, we have analysis. And analysis is what happened on the network, what policy decisions did I make, how did I apply them to that endpoint, and how do I audit or how do I understand the accounting aspect of how those devices were allowed on the network. And in 4 out of 5 of these, we can say that Identity Services Engine is a major aspect, whether it's policy and governance, whether it's identity, whether it's vulnerability management, whether it's enforcement or whether it's analytics. ICE has a major impact and major use case as part of this capability. So when we talk about zero trust, now we also have to talk about the idea of, okay, where are we within our overall zero trust journey? And as part of this zero trust journey, what you're going to see is ICE will then play its part in terms of feeding identity into your traffic maps. It's going to be part of your policy based segmentation. It's going to be a major aspect of that consistent onboarding. And of course, the contextual identity piece of that. When we utilize ICE, we're utilizing ICE as part of what we would refer to as a security onion, which is a layered enforcement mechanism where any layer can be combined with the layer above or below it so that we can ensure that there are multiple enforcement mechanisms that a given endpoint has to go through to ensure that it is allowed onto the network. And when any given mechanism may not prevent that user or machine, then there's another one above it which may. So now, why does this apply so heavily to ICE? And why does it seem like it's so hard? Because let's face it, there's already guides out there, and many of the people on this call here will recognize these two resources that I've put on the slide here in terms of the ICE scale and iceberg pages that give us that capability to say, okay, how many endpoints can my deployment handle based on estimations? But then I get a lot of customers as a professional services engineer who come to me and say, well, is that really the case? Can it really only handle 50,000? And is 50,000 a hard limit? Is it a soft limit? Do I have to worry about when endpoints are on the network versus off the network? How does this all play into licensing? And that's why we kind of created this presentation here and started using it with my customers to essentially say, let's kind of think about scaling in a slightly different way. And when it comes to scaling, the first thing I tell my customers, especially in pre-sales, is let's talk about your use cases. Let's understand what you know is out on your network. The typical network is going to have something to the extent of corporate devices, or at least we hope. But then there may also be factory areas. There may be healthcare areas. There may be building management areas where we have HVAC or some sort of building monitoring systems. Physical security devices. IP security cameras will be the death of me someday because they are such a beast when it comes to coming onto the network and their behaviors on a given network. Digital media, smart signage, baggage handling systems, guest and passenger type endpoints. These are all use cases that we see on a daily basis with our variety of customers. And each of them really has to be understood in terms of its implication. And first off, starting off with that contextual identity piece, what that contextual identity means to the network overall. So when we start to talk through what some of these aspects mean to us, we start to also have to consider, okay, how do we scale these types of use cases when it comes to an identity services deployment implementation? And when we do an implementation, what we're going to find is various mediums have larger resource consumption on ICE. Something like an IoT camera is going to differ in how it authenticates and what its authentication stream and authorization stream looks like as compared to your standard run of the mill PC. And this is going to be based on packet size. More than likely, it's going to be based on frequency as well as quantity. And then there's the delay and latency factors that also factor into this overall consumption. And the way that we think of things is as opposed to the way that it's phrased within the scaling guide of 100,000 endpoints, 100,000 sessions. With advanced services, we think of things as opposed to as phrased as units. So each type of endpoint consumes a number of units. Now, let's talk about why this is the case and go into one example that we recently saw on a customer deployment. We had an access camera, and that access camera came onto the network, and it came directly out of the box configured for 802.1x. It would present a certificate to ICE, and then it would get a failure because that certificate's issue was not trusted by ICE. We didn't have it in the trusted store. And I know the easiest answer that anybody would look at and say, well, why don't you just put the manager or the certificate issuer into your trusted store? Well, it was a very secure environment. And it was the type of environment that everything had to be both under a change freeze to, or a change request to actually implement this, but also the customer desired a centralized certificate authority architecture to be utilized for this camera and for any device that came on to their network. Now, the challenge that we run into is cameras like this will authenticate, but then there's no back off mechanism. There's no suppression mechanism. And a PC, a Mac, a Linux workstation, a lot of times will authenticate, but then it'll just say, hey, authentication failed. It'll tell you within your network connections area, hey, we don't really have the ability to authenticate here, authentication failed, and it'll go on hiatus for minutes at a time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever's configured. Access cameras, because they're IoT devices, will keep hammering ICE. And every 60 seconds, we got an authentication request. As you can imagine, authenticating against the box that many times also meant we had a ton of logs in the live logs. And essentially, those live logs were starting to get filled up and starting to prevent us from troubleshooting other devices. We had a lot of noise in the system as opposed to that little bit of signal that we needed. And this just goes to show that when it comes to an IoT device, when it comes to a limited network stack or limited feature capabilities within the authentication mechanism for one of these types of devices, they will limit the number of these types of devices that ICE can handle. And we see that when we look at the scaling documentation as well, as we have different use cases, whether it's posture authentication, whether it's the internal CA certificate issuance, or whether it's a profiling or guest or BYOD, you see that there's a significant difference in the number of endpoints per use case that we can handle in terms of our scaling capabilities. And this is directly reflective of the idea of thinking about endpoints as units. So let's go into an example calculation. So we know that a wired device, as opposed to a wireless device or a posture IoT device, etc., a wired device is going to be relatively straightforward. We plug in this wired PC, this wired Mac device, etc., and it will try to authenticate to ICE. It'll send anywhere between 6 and 30 packets to ICE and say, I want to authenticate. And here's my client hello, here's my server hello, here's my authentication credentials, etc., etc. And if it gets a success, fantastic. It goes quiet until the re-authentication timer ticks down and forces it to re-authenticate again. If it fails authentication, well, it'll go into a slight hiatus, and then it'll come back on after a certain number of minutes as configured. So for that reason, we determined that the wired device is a little bit less resource heavy when it comes to authenticating against ICE. Now, there used to be a fun presentation that Craig Hypes used to do about scaling ice and ice best practices when it came to design. And he used to tell the story of skateboarders on college campuses. Now, I went to Rochester Institute of Technology back in 2009 when we were implementing it. We were one of the largest wireless deployments authenticating against Identity Services Engine in the country. And we had this one area called the quarter mile. And the quarter mile was a quarter mile distance between the academic buildings and the residential buildings. And as students would go up and down that quarter mile, we placed outdoor APs so that they would be able to maintain their connectivity from one point to the other. However, that same connectivity can also be impacted by skateboarders who would skateboard up and down the quarter mile, who would essentially DDoS ICE because they would skip from AP to AP across tens of APs and cause an authentication for their mobile device, for example, in their pocket against ICE over and over and over again as we transitioned from AP to AP. So, what we see with something like that is because these devices move, because there's essentially a reestablishment of that session every time that wireless device moves from AP to AP, we have to account for a little bit more in terms of what it needs in terms of resources for its capabilities to authenticate against ICE and what ICE can handle there. So when we look at this, we assign typically 2 units to Identity Services Engine for a wireless endpoint. And then you have those IP security cameras. You have the MRI machines. You have the IoT devices, such as sensors that sit out in the field. Limited network stacks, interacting, authenticating over and over again, and essentially coming up, going to sleep, coming up, going to sleep. So when we take a look at assigning a value to them, we say, hey, it's about 4 units when it comes to an IoT endpoint. So you can see in this example here, if I have 1 unit for 10,000 wired devices, that's 10,000. If I have 2 units for another 10,000 wireless devices, that's going to be 30,000. And then if I have 5,000 IoT devices, that's going to be another 20,000, creating a total of 50,000 capacity to fit into the jar that is ICE. And you may recognize this story from a TED talk that was about living your life to its fullest. I encourage you to go out there and look at it in terms of what are the major things that you should focus on and put the most amount of effort into. But coming back to ICE, the ICE Cisco best practice is always to plan for redundancy. So now, if I need a 3655 for 50,000 units, I'm going to encourage my customer to have two 3655s out there at minimum to be able to allow for the capacity of 50,000 spread across two in case of a total failure of 1 unit. Using another example here, if we had 20,000 IoT endpoints, and this was something like a gas pipeline utilizing sensors all over the place, if this was just used for facilities management or building management, and we just had 20,000 IoT endpoints, I would multiply that by 4, just based on the packet stream and the overhead in terms of the interactions with ICE. Now, essentially, what I'm going to say is you need about 80,000 units or two 3655s or one 3695 to account for the authentications and capabilities. Now, a lot of my customers will say, okay, well, that's great. That's fantastic. But what if I don't know what's out on my network? Because let's face it, the entire purpose behind ICE is to give me that capability to take unknowns and kind of turn all those unknowns into known devices. And then eventually, what I want to do is I want to assign a policy that takes those known devices, puts them all into the same policies or same groupings, and essentially classifies them and applies consistent policy. Well, the other alternative for a net new environment, if you don't have ICE out there already, and you can't necessarily say exactly what's out there, is to scale with this same methodology based on your onboarding process. Now, we advocate very heavily for onboarding processes because it's something that we don't see as often as we would really like to within our customer environments. The onboarding process is the idea that any device that comes into your network has to be put into some sort of centralized database. And in a lot of ways, we're starting down that path. We're doing a lot better around that path than we were 10 years ago, especially with the use of things like Meraki Systems Manager, AirWatch by VMware, and the different onboarding capabilities of these MDMs. And it's the same thing that goes for System Center Configuration Manager, for Jamf, etc. Where we're seeing a lot of focus now put into the onboarding process is with ServiceNow. So what you can do is if you utilize ServiceNow and you utilize the asset database within ServiceNow, you can say, okay, let me go in there and let me try to break these down in the categories to understand how many of each type of device I may have out there, and then utilize this 1, 2, and 4 math to kind of understand how many units would I need for my identity services implementation. And going back to the title of of the presentation here, success over the long term, that's why we have kind of come up with this methodology. The long-term ability to maintain your ICE implementation and scale out in addition to what you have right now by 20, 30, 50% is the most important aspect for any implementation of identity services engine. Now, most of my customers will then say, okay, let me look at the guide. I'm just going to go with the guide. Why should I care about scaling accuracy? Well, I mean, the guide does give us a good guideline on how many endpoints a given ICE implementation can accommodate. And that given ICE implementation is going to be able to accommodate the basic use cases, authentication for wired and wireless, and basic profiling. And we saw in that scale table previously that profiling can handle up to about 200 authentications per minute to give us that capability, or sorry, 200 authentications per second, to give us that capability to say, let me get all these devices onto the network. Bang, we're done. But then we have to start talking about that concept that I utilized before in the beginning of the presentation, what we refer to as trust boundaries. The reason why I talk so much about trust boundaries is typically for my customers that are looking to implement TrustSec. TrustSec is a layer 2 authorization mechanism that can allow for two devices to interact on the same VLAN, switch, campus, etc., based on a header that's placed inside, based on an identifier that's placed into the frame header. Now, most of my customers are working towards TrustSec as essentially a segmentation mechanism to have in their network to prevent unauthorized interactions. And as we start to implement these trust boundaries and expand these trust boundaries from a VLAN, a switch, a building, a campus, et cetera, to other VLAN switches, buildings, campuses, et cetera, we also have to focus on now how many of these devices are going to have to be authorized? How many am I going to use the enforcement mechanism of TrustSec for? As opposed to when I get to the point of contextual identity, that who, what, where, when, how. As I utilize this who, what, where, when, how many of these devices are going to not fall into my segmentation plan, are going to fall outside or be a unique use case, et cetera, and need to utilize some other enforcement mechanism, whether it's a downloadable VLAN, a downloadable ACL, firewalls, DNS, et cetera. So coming back to the idea of scaling based on authentication mechanisms, we know that authentication mechanisms in terms of transactions per second for the less complicated capabilities such as PAP or even some of the PEEP capabilities are going to be significantly higher in scale than some of the more challenging ones like TEEP or EPTLS, et cetera. So for those customers saying, okay, I already have an ICE deployment, how do I determine my potential scale? Well, this is something that we answer a lot because there is a mechanism to go about this. It isn't a number on a dashboard that says, hey, you have X number of sessions left, or this is how many sessions that we're going to allow for you to join in beyond the licensing mechanisms. What we use for advanced services is what we refer to as KPIs, or the key performance indicators, which is a report within ICE. And what that key performance indicators provides to us is kind of a breakdown of what is the load that is present on each of my policy services nodes. Well, within each of the policy services nodes, now I can take those key performance metrics, and that key performance metric will give me the average load, the max load, the transactions per second, average latency. And I can cross reference that with active sessions that are currently present on each of those nodes. And this takes a little bit of munging. It takes a little bit of additional work that needs to be done, but you can essentially do the active sessions report and the KPIs report and compare them side by side to say this PSN currently has 65,000 or so sessions. And you'll see that in this column here, the current total sessions. And you'll see that there. And then you can compare that against my load or my transactions per second load. And I can say, okay, if I extrapolate upon this, now if I assume that at the current load, at the 56%, 56, sorry, at the 44% load that I currently have with 56 additional expansion, now what does this look like if I want the 65% watermark, 75, 85, 95, and 100? And this goes back to what we were talking about before. Because if we take a 3695 that we rate for 100,000 endpoints, and we can get 100,000 endpoint sessions present on that node, why does it look like when I extrapolate out, really it's only 88,000? Or at a 56% expansion load, well, I only have 46,000 endpoints on that node at the moment. And it comes down to utilizing this math of what are the types of endpoints that this customer had on their deployment, giving them that capability. What I'll typically do as well is I'll start to look at trends. And I use, being a former math major and recovering computer science major, I will use mean, median, and mode. What is the average load that I have on a given endpoint hour over hour? What is the median and what is the mode? And the mode is a little bit more challenging because it's multiple decimal points and sometimes they don't match up. But you can essentially get a report like this that says mean, median, and mode. How many more sessions can I handle within my ICE deployment per node? Well, based on this, I have significant expansion capabilities with a lot of these having in the 56 percentile ability for me to expand out. Now, a couple considerations so that as you start to put together these reports and trying to understand these reports for your key performance metrics as well as your active sessions at any given time. There was a bug if you're still running 2.7 patch 8, patch 7 or below, where some Java related memory limits were hard coded. So what we commonly saw at the time was over 100% utilization, which just didn't make sense when it came to CPU. Also consider your maximum load times. Going back to that idea of utilizing the mean, median, and mode, understand that at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, when all your users are rolling in a given time zone or given geographic area, you're going to have a higher load for endpoints coming on in that geographic area. So what you're going to see is kind of this rolling effect of a higher average load as the sun comes up and as users come on to the network as you get across the country if you have PSN staged across the country. Same thing goes for users connecting early in the day to VPN after lunch or during set reauth periods. So if you have an 8-hour reauth period, That 8-hour re-auth period essentially means that if someone came on at 8 o'clock, they're going to have to re-auth again at 4 o'clock, and you're going to start seeing a lot of re-auths around the same time based on those patterns. The final aspect that I'll talk about on this is one of my final slides here is going to be security services as your success differentiator. As I mentioned, I work for Cisco Professional Services or Cisco Services. We have three different branches. We have the advisory branch, the integration branch, and the managed services branch. Many of us work across multiple branches. I work across advisory and integration. Essentially, advisory is the ability for us to work with our customers in a technology agnostic way so that we can work through what do you need and what weaknesses do you have within your network so that we can help you put together a strategy for how to move forward. If you're currently on a competitor product to ICE, for example, we can work with you and say, what is that competitor doing for you? What are they doing well? What are they not doing so well? How does ICE compare based on the outcomes that you're expecting? When we take this sort of approach, it is not meant to sell you a Cisco product. It is meant to work with you to determine what your success criteria and outcomes are going to be. In terms of the integration piece, this is where we start to work through plan, design, and implement with you as part of your implementation strategy. So when you hire in Advanced Services comes in and says, our best practices around identity services engine, around switch configs, around wireless LAN controller configs, look something like this. And as we align those to the outcomes and the use cases that you have, here's how we would implement them. And then finally, Cisco is a managed services provider. And I know a lot of our customers don't know about that, but we do have a managed services arm that can do those add, change, removes for you, can work with you and your NOC or SOC for both your health and wellness aspects as well as implementation aspects. And these three services combined, I am Captain Planet, but at the same time, it does help our customers move the ball forward in significant ways. So just as good, kind of the standard wrap-up slides here, any webinar surveys that pop up after closing WebEx, please answer them. If you don't want to give me the highest score, please leave a comment as to why. Tell me a little bit more about what I could improve on this presentation. I will read every response, I guarantee it. And then additional ICE resources. I already mentioned Iceberg, which was on one of the first slides that I presented there. But also we have additional YouTube channels, webinars, communities, etc. And with that, I'll turn it over for any live questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Patrick. Let me go ahead and check out what we have here in our Q&A. I know our panelists have been doing a great job in handling the questions here. So let me see if we have anything outstanding from our audience. And actually, it looks like we've covered all of the questions from the audience. So I think we are good to go, Patrick. If unless you have any closing comments for our audience, I think we're good to go.
No, so I do see just a couple questions in there. Going into do we have a specific calculator in terms of rule of thumb for how many authentications what we would consider as part of scalability? I'll go back to this slide real quick, just in case it has any additional follow-ups or questions that anybody might have. Coming back here. Here, let me just do this. Yep, come on. Let's go back here. So going back to the point that I was making earlier, there is no specific calculator for something like this, mostly because we just haven't put it onto a website or anything like that. And also because it really comes down to what types of endpoints does a customer have in their network. What we've done our best to do is simplify scaling. And that's why when it comes to a slide like this, it isn't something that we put out there all that often because let's face it, it can be a confusing topic. We've tried to say, overall, here's what our general recommendations and here's what the general capacity of each of the appliances is. That general capacity and general capabilities works for the 75th percentile of customers. When it comes to advanced services or when it comes to managed services, as we're going to be owning an overall deployment for customers, something like this is what we're going to rely on to give us that capability that when Susie in accounting buys 100 new IoT devices that are going to be sitting in the office in our smart devices so that workers can listen to music in their offices or something like that, we can guarantee that we're going to have the capacity and the capability to add those devices onto the network overall.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick. And actually, Patrick, we did have another one come in as you were explaining this question here. What is the best strategy for organizing your policy creation in a 3K device environment, such as starting with grouping by excuse me, OUI, then further grouping by DHCP params, etc.
So what I will generally do when I start off with an implementation is the first step is put everything in monitor mode. I want to see everything coming on to the network. I want to give it the ability to do passive authentication with MAC authentication bypass. And I want to be able to kind of classify those unknowns and turn them into classifieds. At some point, you're going to start seeing patterns. You're going to see that I have Ricoh, Zebra, Xerox printers, HP printers, whatever, and I have those four varieties, but they all kind of work the same. They just need network connectivity. They're just going to be authenticating, and hey, we're going to give them a downloadable ACL that ensures they can only talk to their print servers. So what I'm going to generally do is I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to create a logical profile, and that logical profile is going to group those devices into a singular policy. And then I'm going to have a little bit broader of a result that I apply to it. That may be a singular printer's VLAN. So all the printers get put on the same VLAN. That could be either by name or that could be by number, depending on what your organization's architecture looks like there. In addition, that could be a downloadable ACL. That downloadable ACL could say, I'm going to allow access to any one of these four print servers from any one of these printers, because that printer should be configured to get to its respective print server. So now I'm going to create a broad ACL that says you're allowed to talk to any one of these four print servers for the respective device type. And I'm going to continue with that kind of methodology for any of my HVAC devices, whether it's a thermostat, whether it's a chiller, whether it's a monitoring system. I'm going to put all of those into another logical profile. And the goal is to kind of break the network up into the broad use cases and apply broad capabilities to restrict these devices. Over time, you can get a little bit more strict about what capabilities these endpoints are able to do on the network in terms of putting them on a specific VLAN, restricting them from talking to certain resources, et cetera. But the reason why I approach it this way is if I have 3,000 devices today and 5,000 devices tomorrow, as I continue to kind of scale out ICE, I want to make it easy on my operations team. My operations team, the last thing I want them to do is go in and take off the authentication from a port to get a device onto the network. I want to give it a little bit broader access that protects me a little bit more than full access to the network. But at the same time, then I can start to classify these devices and I have a lot more signal and a lot less noise to essentially say, I'm going to have a fall through policy of anything hitting default or anything hitting a quarantine policy to put onto a quarantine VLAN, et cetera. I'll continue to work through that and move devices into their respective groupings or respective logical profiles. But at the same time, I don't, again, I want to make it easy on my operations team to know what is hitting the right policy and what is hitting the wrong policy. And the easiest way to do that is to broaden out what the right policy is.
That was a great explanation. Thank you so much, Patrick, for that one. Another question that came in just a moment ago is, are there implementations that are better fit for multiple ice clusters rather than a single large ice cluster?
That's a really good question. So, multiple ice clusters, where I typically see multiple ice clusters implemented, is when geographic regions are broad in nature. So, while we have expanded out the capability to have latency numbers of 300 milliseconds between ice nodes themselves, and while Radius has the capability based on the protocol of a 30-second session for that endpoint to answer correctly and interact with the ICE node, et cetera. Sometimes that isn't enough for geographic areas, such as having an implementation in California and another one in London. Same thing goes for Australia, India, et cetera. When we see a lot of the broad geographic boundaries between ICE nodes, that's when we start to see latency issues that are felt by the customer because you introduce that latency of milliseconds or full seconds between packets going back and forth from the network access device up to ICE. So when I start to look at multiple ICE implementations or multiple ICE deployments, I'm going to do something to the extent of I'm going to lay out what my geographic footprint is and plan for what my latency is there. Even though we say 300 milliseconds, that's typically the max that you typically want to be a- allowing within the implementation. I scale that back to say 250 or 200 milliseconds and say, okay, if it's over, say, 250 milliseconds from California to London, I'm probably going to want to put a smaller deployment in one area or another, and then just work on replicating my policy manually between the two deployments.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Patrick. Appreciate you addressing those questions for our audience. I think that takes care of all of the outstanding questions. So I think we can go ahead and wrap up our presentation for today. So, again, I just want to give you a very big thanks, Patrick, for speaking about this topic with our audience. I hope that everyone found great value in the information and resources that were shared here today. I would also like to extend a very big thank you to each and every one of our panelists for lending a hand with all of the questions throughout the webinar. We really appreciate it. And for our attendees, if you do have any additional questions or would like to continue the conversation about today's topic, we do encourage you to participate in our online post-webinar discussion. You are going to be redirected there upon exit, but I'm going to go ahead and post a link into the chat window here in just a moment. So we do look forward to your participation. And just a quick reminder that you will also receive a short pop-up survey as soon as you exit this webinar. And we would be so grateful if you can just take a few minutes to complete it and let us know how you like today's presentation. We always look forward to receiving your valuable feedback. And for those of you who may be interested in revisiting this session, we will have the recording available for on-demand viewing within approximately 5 business days after today. And I'll be sure to share some information in the chat window on how you can check out that recording when it becomes available. And also another reminder about our next set of webinars. So next month, we're going to be hosting IBNS 2.0 switch templates for ICE deployments. That's going to be on October 1st. And taking us closer to the end of the year, we're going to have ICE integration with Splunk. That's going to be on November 5th. The registration for the October session is now open, and November's registration is going to be coming soon. But I'm going to be posting the chat window here in just a moment to how you can register for October session if you haven't already done so. So we do encourage you to join us for these sessions. And again, I'm going to post a link into the chat window right now for your reference. Thanks again to our presenter, to our panelists, and to all of our attendees for joining us here live. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.